Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth MicroTeach. This week we're going to be going over cognition and learning, and specifically we're going to be going over Module 28, which is on classical conditioning. I don't think we're going to be able to get to operant conditioning. Really, operant conditioning is more focused on punishment and reward. So it's fairly straightforward, whereas some of the stuff in classical conditioning, some of the terms and really the theory behind it all works together, can get kind of confusing. So I want to just clarify a lot of it and go more into depth of Pavlov's experiment and just really use that example to clarify some of those terms. So let's just go ahead and jump straight into it. So Pavlov kind of fell into his experiment by accident. He actually worked a lot with animals, had a lot of dogs in his lab, and he had an assistant that came in and would feed them. And he kind of noticed over just having the dogs in a period of time that every time this assistant would come in, the dogs would perk up and start to salivate for no really reason, but they know that he fed them. And so Pavlov kind of noticed this and was like, what's going on here to where these dogs aren't responding to the food, but they're responding to the person that's giving them food, and he wanted to test it a little bit further. So he started off by kind of conceptualizing what's known as the unconditioned stimulus. And this stimulus is going to be something that is set on its own and is innate and elicits a response. And that response is going to be an unconditioned response. So for Pavlov's experiment, the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the food. So the food is going to elicit the unconditioned response, which is going to be the salivating. And this occurs naturally. There's no intervention by the experimenter manipulating anything. This is just what's happening naturally. And you're going to actually introduce a neutral stimulus, which for Pavlov's experiment is the bell. So this neutral stimulus is going to be something that's not actively related, so the dogs weren't just going to salivate to a bell ringing on their own. He had to condition them to do that. So this neutral stimulus essentially turns into a conditioned stimulus, which is the stimulus that you're going to use to condition the individual, animal, whatever it's going to be. So it's pretty straightforward. It's the stimulus you're using to condition them. It's the conditioned stimulus. So you do this by pairing the conditioned stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus. So this is Pavlov pairing the bell to the food. So he's consistently trying to pair this bell to the food to eventually get it to where the dogs can salivate to the bell on its own and the food doesn't have to be present. So it's best to pair these two about a half-second to 5-second intervals. You want to do it pretty immediately so that the subject can essentially get that these two things are being paired and that they're going to want it to be treated as the same, essentially. So after this is done, it takes many trials. It definitely doesn't happen on the first time, the second time, third time. You're going to get what's called a conditioned response. And this is a learned response to the conditioned stimulus. So this is going to be his ultimate experiment, which was that the dogs were salivating now to just ringing the bell. That he could walk in there, ring a bell, and the dogs would begin to salivate because they associated that with food. And that association kind of gets into the idea of expectancies, that these dogs are expecting the reward, which is going to be the food. And your book goes into a little bit, and it is kind of, I guess, debated. It's being seen more. Pavlov didn't really talk too much about it, but research is kind of showing more that our expectancies are more really in tune with our day-to-day lives. But as we go through this process, we're going to first go through a stage called acquisition. And this is that learning phase. This is that pairing phase. It's kind of, if you can imagine, on an upward slope is acquisition, and on the downward slope is going to be extinction. So acquisition is coming with the consistent pairing of these stimulus, and then extinction is going to come on the downward slope where these are no longer being paired, and that this connection is kind of deteriorating in a sense when these two aren't paired. So this is like if Pavlov stopped pairing the bell with the food. So if he walked in, rung a bell, the dogs salivate, he walked out. He does this over a course of many trials. At some point, the dogs will get that the bell no longer means the same as the food, and they'll stop salivating. So that's kind of the extinction process, whereas the acquisition was the learning side of it. So extinction happens fairly rapidly, but you don't lose everything that you're conditioned to. So there's what's called spontaneous recovery, which is going to be when, after this kind of conditioning is unlearned, it's kind of an easy way to recover that condition. So if Pavlov was to stop pairing the bell to food, he was to kind of walk, like I said, walk in, ring the bell, and then walk out. Over time, they would lose this connection, but then he could walk back in and restart the process, and much quicker than the first time they learned it, they could relearn, okay, the bell food, I'll start salivating again. So that's kind of the idea, the concept behind spontaneous recovery. And it kind of also attaches to what's known as stimulus generalization, which would be, okay, Pavlov's ringing a bell, but if he blows a whistle, that's kind of similar, and you could maybe generalize, they might salivate to a whistle over time, and you can generalize this stimulus to other things that aren't the conditioned stimulus. Excuse me. But even with that, you have stimulus discrimination, which is that ability to discriminate between the bell and a whistle or a car horn or something like that. You can discriminate between stimuli, and this is how you're conditioned to different things that might even be fairly similar. So you could have one where the dogs salivate to a bell being ringed, or they get anxious to a whistle because he pairs that with some sort of fear response. So you can have many different responses and stimuli kind of conditioning a subject, but it's important that they can discriminate between those and not generalize them all to the same response. Also included in this chapter, kind of spanning off of Pavlov's experiment, is going to be conditioned emotional responses. Your book goes into a little bit about the rabbit and the little Albert study, where actually it's kind of an unethical study, but they pair an infant to fear rabbits by having him pet like a soft bunny, and then slamming a hammer to scare him and surprise him and make him cry, so that over time, when he sees the bunny, he immediately is conditioned to the response of being in fear, and he actually becomes afraid of bunnies. And I guess where I say it comes in unethically is that they never unconditioned him to that, and they don't know where he is, so he's just some guy out there with a death fear of bunnies, I guess. But this conditioned emotional response comes in many forms, and it can be included in systematic desensitization, where you're actually exposing people to the object of their fear. So this is how somebody might overcome some phobias. It's actually used in therapy a lot to have people, okay, I have a deathly fear of snakes. Okay, well, we're not going to just first put you in by putting you in a pit of snakes and locking you in there, and that's how you're going to get out of your fear. We have to gradually desensitize you to this conditioned response of being, this emotionally conditioned response of being afraid of the stimulus of seeing a snake. So they might start with, okay, let's start with a picture of a snake. And then, you can build up to, okay, now you can be in the same room as a snake. Okay, now maybe you can sit next to the tank, and then maybe you can, have your arm on the tank, and now your arm's in the tank, and then you can pet it. And you kind of build up this desensitization to where you can overcome your fears. Excuse me. You also have what's called vicarious classical conditioning, which is secondhand conditioning, where you can actually be conditioned by just seeing somebody else essentially respond. So it's kind of a mirroring of another person, in that you are taking their classical conditioning and kind of responding that to yourself just by watching them. There is a function in classical conditioning itself, which is of higher order, where you can actually associate more objects and more things to that conditioned response. And really, this is it's gonna take the form of excuse me, of adding another condition or adding another stimulus to that kind of process. So it's very much kind of like I was saying with that whistle. It's first you're starting with the bell, and you're conditioning that response to the salivation of the food. But then you can introduce a whistle that would respond to the bell, and then now you can just blow the whistle, and they're gonna salivate to the food. And then maybe you can do it as a clap of your hands, and you're making this second order where you're going on and on and on, and creating kind of this order of conditioning where you can make really some crazy things kind of happen, and some people do some crazy things just by building upon this basic conditioning. So that's kind of just the general overview. I know it's a lot. It can be kind of confusing. I try to explain it as easy as possible and as straightforward as possible. But really, if you get nailed down with the terms and understand what each, unconditioned and conditioned and stimulus and response and the differences, it's a lot easier to understand how they all work together and how Pavlov is able to pair stimulus to response to be able to kind of form this conception of his theory. So, as always, if you have any questions over that, just shoot me an email. And other than that, I hope to see you guys next week in class.